The topic today is managing the sales process. And what we're basically talking about here at the most basic level is that we want to basically take the sales process and organize it a little bit more and simplify the steps that you're trying to take a prospect through. The sales process that we're going to give you is actually only 3 steps, and I'll show you what those are here in a minute. And you might think, well, my product's different from all other products being sold, so how can I use your sales process? Or you may say, well, every prospect is unique, so how can we have some sort of simple 3 steps that we try to take a prospect through? The reality is that the 3 steps that I give you can be used for just about any product or service. And sure, sometimes there's some modifications, but you can use these 3 steps, especially in the early stages of talking to a prospect. You can try to take someone through these 3 steps, and what it can do is it can simplify what you're trying to do and provide more clarity for what you're trying to accomplish. And the other thing that we want to do with these 3 steps is we want you to become more aware of where you are in the process, and that will help you to identify what you need to do at each step. And so these 3 simple steps are going to make selling a lot easier, and it's going to make it a lot easier for you to know what to say and ask, because at all of the different steps, there are different things that you should focus on trying to accomplish and different questions to ask. And I'm going to show you all of that here. So it's going to be, it'll be very simple and very simple to adopt if you agree with what I show you. Now, a lot of people might see, a training module on the sales process as not being the most important or the most urgent thing for them to work on. Meaning, a lot of salespeople might think, well, I'm okay once I have my foot in the door. So they might say, I need help with cold calling, cold emailing, email prospecting, dealing with gatekeepers, dealing with objections. That's what they want to work on. Once they're engaged, they can figure out what process to take the prospect through or what to do next by improvising in that particular moment. And I actually don't completely agree with that. I actually believe this is one of the most important topics and modules of the Smart Sales System, because all of those things I just talked about that most people are interested in all point back to this module and the concepts discussed here and build on what we talked about here. For example, when it comes to figuring out what to say and ask, depending on what step you are in the process will impact what you say and ask. Regarding improving your cold calling is actually at the very beginning of the sales process. So knowing what steps you're trying to take a prospect through will impact what you try to do and what you try to accomplish when you're cold calling. It'll impact what you do and say when you're emailing. It'll impact the questions you ask. It'll impact how you try to resolve and get around objections. And it can impact what you're closing, because the different steps you try to take a prospect through can impact what you try to close for. And all of these are chapters and topics later to come in the Smart Sales System, and those will all point back to the concepts we talk about here today. So this is one of the most important topics and modules and chapters in the Smart Sales System. And just to show you why this is so important, just to kind of drill into the topic of closing, when you're a salesperson and you're talking to a prospect, whether that's talking to them on a call or in a meeting or in an email, every time you're interacting with a prospect, you have 2 different goals that you can focus on. The ultimate goal is to sell the product and service, and I do agree that that's really at the end of the day what's most important. It's how you and your business make money, make commissions. It's how you will achieve your targets and improve your career and have a healthy job and job security. And then on the other hand, you at every given interaction, you have an immediate goal. And the immediate goal is to get the prospect to agree to move to the next step of your sales process. And the interesting thing here is that there is only one point in the sales process when these 2 goals are the same thing, and that is when you're at the very end of the sales process and it's time for the prospect to purchase and agree to purchase your product. At that point, these goals are the exact same. But up until that point, these will always be two different goals. And I bring this up because if you're a salesperson, if you follow your natural instinct is to talk about the product and to close the sale and to get people interested in buying from you. What we can often do is fall into the trap that we often just put the gas pedal all the way down, and we always focus on really the ultimate goal of trying to get people interested in buying what we sell. That sounds logical. You're a salesperson, you have a product you sell. When you're talking to a prospect, try to get them interested in buying what you sell. Well, there's a few problems with that, and you can actually be more successful if you resist that natural instinct a little bit and focus more on just trying to get the prospect to move to the next step of your sales process. So, for example, if the next step of your sales process is to start a conversation, set an appointment, schedule a meeting, then if you focus more on that and less on trying to validate if the prospect needs what you have today, that can impact what you say. It can impact the questions you ask. It can impact how you close. It can impact how you respond to objections. And we're going to keep coming back to that every chapter of the Smart Sales System. So let me give you a few examples of how some salespeople focus more on the ultimate goal of trying to close the product and why that might not be optimum, especially when you're trying to take a prospect through a series of sales process steps. So a real life example, and I just kind of always use the same one because it's just a great example. One day, a payroll outsourcing salesperson called me up, and she established the call. I won't go into her whole call script or what she said, but the main thing she asked me was, after the call was established, she asked me, "Are you guys looking to evaluate other payroll providers?" And the reality was we were currently outsourcing to her competitor. I wasn't thinking about doing an evaluation, and my answer to that was no, not really. And then I gave her another objection, and the call ended thereafter. Now, the problem with that question was, are you guys looking to switch? Right? So she was basically asking, are you interested in buying what I sell? Are you interested in making a change? Are you actively, in the buying process for what I sell? Now, those aren't questions she asked, but those are really the implied questions of what she asked, which was when she asked me, are you guys currently looking at evaluating other providers? Now, the problem with that is that question is completely aligned with her goal of trying to sell her service. She sells payroll outsourcing. She wants to know, are we currently looking at purchasing switching to a new payroll provider? Now, the problem with that is that her sales process isn't, do you need what I sell? And then she would just sell me that on the phone right then. She even has a sales process where even if I were to make a switch, we would talk many times and do paperwork and have all sorts of questions and conversations. So her goal, she could have been more successful with her call if she focused more on the sales process, which in reality, she could have just focused on starting a conversation. This was the first time she and I had spoken, and she could have focused on scheduling a meeting, setting an appointment with me. And to accomplish that, she doesn't need to worry about if we're looking to evaluate. She could ask me, who are we currently using? But she could have focused more on just trying to have a conversation with me about payroll outsourcing. So she could have said, hey, I know you're probably outsourcing today, or you have someone doing your payroll today. Most likely you're not looking at making a change today, and that's fine. But I'd like to have a conversation with you. We actually help many businesses like yours to decrease costs, improve this, decrease that. She could have shared with me her value, and then said, hey, are you open to having a brief conversation with me? Now, without going into too much detail on that potential call script, the point there is, don't focus on, do I need what you sell today? Focus more on the sales process of just setting the appointment. And she still might have not set an appointment with me. I still might have given her objection. But by focusing on the next step, it could impact what she says, and it can increase her ability to close for the next step over a number of calls, instead of every call that she makes just trying to validate need in buying what she sells. I'll give you another quick example, which is a cold email. I get cold emails all the time from web design companies. So the email will look something like this. Hey, I work for a company, we do web design services. Are you guys looking to currently redo your website, right? So this is what I sell. Do you need what I sell today? That sales pitch message, what they're saying in that email, is all aligned with the ultimate goal of selling what they sell today. So if they shift that message, now what's the sales process? The sales process is to have a conversation about websites, might be the next step. Have a phone conversation, have an appointment. So if they focus more on setting on that goal, their message could change to something like this. Hey, we do web design services. You probably might not be looking to redesign your website today, and that's completely fine. I actually have looked at your website, and I have some ideas of small changes you could do to improve conversion rate. Are you open to having a conversation where I can share those ideas and also share some ideas of how I've helped someone else? And then, so we'll just leave it there. That could be a cold email message. That message is more aligned with the immediate goal of setting an appointment. So those are just two examples of how focusing more on the sales process can impact what you say, and being more aware of the steps you're trying to take a prospect through can make selling easier, can improve the questions you ask. It can also impact the way you respond to objections. A quick example on objection handling is if a prospect says, we don't have budget today, then that's the objection. If you're focused on the ultimate goal of selling the product, it might not make sense talking to that prospect because they don't have budget today. It doesn't make any sense for you to talk to them because you can't sell your product. But if your process is to have a conversation, schedule a meeting, set an appointment, then the fact that they don't have budget today is actually not a valid objection. It doesn't even make sense because you're not trying to sell your product. You're just trying to have a conversation, and then you can worry about the fact that they don't have budget after that conversation, and that can impact what you do after there. Maybe you meet and then you pause until they have budget. But if you understand the steps you're trying to take someone through, it can make it more clear how you can respond to objection handling. By the way, so those three things I talked about, cold calling, cold emailing, objection handling, those are individual modules in the Smart Sales System, and we're going to spend a whole module talking about those topics. So if some of that sounded interesting to you and you want more, we're going to drill into all of that, provide a lot more examples. My point here today is that all of those topics build on what we're going to talk about here today, so this is extremely important. Now let's get into these three different steps. The first step is the initial contact. So this is the first time you're really interacting and speaking with someone. The next step is the meeting. So this is where you're having a real established longer conversation. And then the third step is the presentation step. So this is how when you share how you can help someone. So regardless of what you sell, I think the most complex and also the simplest of products can go through these three steps. So let's drill into each step and talk about what that looks like and what you should accomplish in each step. So if we drill into the initial contact, you might hear me talk about initial contact and you might think, oh yeah, that's a cold call. Sure, it could be a cold call. It could also be a cold email. Again, remember, this is the first time we're interacting with a little bit of back and forth with someone. It could also be meeting someone at a networking event. It could also be an inbound call. Maybe someone was referred to you, or they came across your website and they called you and called your main number, got referred to you, routed to you through a switchboard. It could be an inbound email. Maybe someone sends an email to your company, or someone sends an email to a web inquiry submission form on your website. It could also be a customer interacting with you or your company through a website chat window. It could also be interacting with a prospect over social media. So the point here is you don't need to memorize that. The main thing I want you to kind of digest is that this is the first time you're interacting with someone, and it could be interacting with them in any different way given the different methods or technologies we have today. So in this first interaction, you have a few goals, and it's important to know what these goals are so you don't try to accomplish too much. For example, your goal of the initial contact is not to sell the product. And so you should sort of remove that from your mind, and that could be something new for you to kind of realize or think about if you're in product selling mode where you're always trying to sell the product or validate a need for what you sell. At this point, you're really only trying to pre-qualify the prospect, which is just to determine, does it even make sense for us to have a conversation? You're not trying to determine, are they the decision maker? Do they have money? It doesn't matter. You're just trying to determine, are they in the general area for needing what you have? And by the way, there's a full module on qualifying the prospect and how to qualify, and we'll talk about that in great detail. But at this point, you're only trying to pre-qualify, so that's just a few soft questions. Then you always want to build interest in what you sell, but you only need to build a little bit of interest, so a little bit of curiosity in what you sell. So you don't need to build interest so that it's at a point where they want to buy what you sell, just enough interest to keep them, basically enough interest so that they agree to move to the next step of your sales process. And the close that in the initial contact is not to close the prospect on validating that they want to buy or need what you sell. The close is closing them on talking in more detail. So that's basically agreeing to have a conversation or scheduling a meeting, setting an appointment. Now the structure for the initial contact is, this is a very short conversation. So it's 2 to 5 minutes. And one of the core concepts of the SMART sales system was focus more on the prospect and focus more on their interests. So to cater that, we want to focus 80% of the initial contact on the prospect and 20% on you. By the way, this might be something new for the product selling salesperson, which would typically try to spend 80% of the initial contact on them. This is what I sell, this is what I do. By the way, an initial contact cold email that for a product selling salesperson is going to be 80% all about the company and the product. So you want to shift, make it 80% about them, 20% about you. And the best salesperson is the one that asks the best questions. The questions to ask in the initial contact are your pain questions and your current environment questions. So we're going to provide you with a lot of different questions. These are the only questions you need to worry about in this brief 2 to 5 minute meeting. Now, and by the way, I just want to point out, I know 2 to 5 minutes sounds like a short time, and you might think, well, there's a lot of cold calls or networking event or times where I talk to a prospect, maybe even in a chat window where you're interacting longer. And so what happens there is either you're taking too much time in the initial contact, or you're moving to the meeting step at the same time as the initial contact. So we actually refer to that as an instant meeting, and we'll talk about what that is later. You need to be aware when an instant meeting is happening. What I really want you to be aware of is where you're at in the sales process when you're talking to a prospect, so you can know the different questions to ask and what different things to accomplish, and you can control the sales process and control the prospect and the interaction to a greater degree. So let's talk about what the meeting looks like. And basically, there's a few different types of meetings that you can have. It could be your classic appointment. You set an appointment, you go out to someone's office. It could also be an online meeting. You meet virtually. It happens more and more in today's world. It could be meeting someone over coffee, over dinner, over a drink. And like I said, it could be an extended cold call. So you're kind of calling them and you end up talking to them for 20, 30 minutes on the same conversation. Then you're basically flowing into the meeting at the same time. It could also be meeting someone at an event. Maybe you met them at the event and you just end up talking to them for an extended period of time. Now, there are some goals for the meeting that are slightly different. So in the initial contact, we were just pre-qualifying the prospect, which is determining, does it even make sense for us to talk? Now you're going to take that to a deeper degree and you want to qualify the prospect. So this is determining, is this prospect for real? Is this someone that's worth me spending my valuable time with? Again, we'll talk about qualifying in more detail later, but this basically means there's going to be different questions to ask. You also still want to continue to build more interest with the prospect. You're still not trying to get them interested enough to buy from you. You want to get them build interest to another level so that they agree to hearing about the options that you have and seeing your presentation basically. And the close is not to close your product sale, but to close for the presentation. The structure is it could be anywhere between 10 to 60 minutes. So for your more simple products, the meeting could be a 5 to 10 minute conversation. For your average products, it might be a 20 to 30 minute meeting. For your more complex products or deeper conversations, it might be a 60-minute meeting. The level of attention in terms of how that's divided in the meeting, so at the initial contact, it was more on the prospect, less on you. Now it evens out. So it's 50% on the prospect, 50% on you. In a 30-minute meeting, what that might look like is you spend the first 15 minutes on the prospect, and you do that by asking questions. And then in ideal scenarios, you ask questions and learn about them. And then you spend the remainder, the second 15 minutes on about you. So how you match up against what they need, how you can help would be ideal. And the questions to ask, you can go back to your pain questions, any pain or current environment questions you haven't asked so far. But now you can start to add in qualifying questions, trying to determine what exactly is going on with the prospect and if they're for real. So once you have done that, then you can move on to the presentation step. And what the presentation can look like is it can look like a traditional presentation where you're showing a set of slides about your product and company and how you can help. It could be a demonstration of your product or service. Now, I will point out many salespeople sell something that's very understood or fairly simple, and there's not a need for a formal presentation. No problem. In that case, you still need to go to the presentation step of the sales process, but your presentation step might be more simple, and it could be you sharing and maybe going through a proposal or a quote with the prospect. By the way, this in a lot of cases, if you don't really worry about these processes, you might be sending over a proposal or a quote to a prospect and just letting them go through that on their own. When you really embrace this process, you might realize that this is the third step of the process, and you should go through the proposal with the prospect. So you can schedule it more as a meeting instead of just sending the document over to them for them to go through it on their own. And for very simple products, the presentation step might be just sharing a list of options. For example, let's say that this is a real life example for me. I had an inspector come out to look to see if I had termites. He did an inspection of my house, and then after the inspection was done, he opened a brochure and said, you can do this, or we could do that, or we could do this. Which one do you want to do? Well, when he showed me that brochure, that was actually the presentation step. So it was a 5-minute conversation, but him going through that and explaining all the different packages was the presentation step. So even if you sell something that's very everyday, very commonly known product or service, you still should or could go through this step. Now the goals are you might want to continue to qualify if you haven't really fully qualified the prospect in the meeting step. At this point, you want to build interest to a level where the prospect is interested in buying what you sell. So this is your real opportunity to communicate what you have to offer, how you differ, how you can help the prospect, and how you match up against their needs. And your goal is to close the prospect on buying your product or service. Now, I want to point out the goal is to close the prospect on your product. Of course, in most situations, there are steps after the presentation. Maybe it's sending over a contract, and maybe there's a redlining or additional meetings, or it has to go through a committee. I don't doubt that for a minute, and probably in more cases than not, that is the situation. But at the end of your presentation, you still should or could close for the validation of buying your product, meaning, do we agree to move forward? Even if there are 10 steps, and even the close could even involve agreeing on the 10 steps. These the 10 steps that need to happen next. Okay, do we agree that you're interested in moving forward to those steps and moving forward? So you could close for validation, if not close for the actual signature. Now the structure is, the presentation could be anywhere between 30 minutes to 2 hours. Where you land on that might be the complexity in what you sell. And the distribution of attention is the exact opposite of what it is at the initial contact. So the initial contact was more on the prospect and less on you. Now it's less on the prospect, 80% on you. What that might look like is you might spend the first 20% of the meeting, the presentation, on them, saying this is what we've learned about you, and then you're all about you and how you can help. Or it could be the first 10 minutes is your findings and about them, then 80% on you and how you can help, and then the 10% at the end for more questions and discussion about the prospect. Questions, you can still go back to any pain questions, current environment questions you haven't asked, and any qualifying questions you haven't asked. The new set of questions here are your closing questions. So this is where you're really trying to close the prospect on moving forward. So those are the 3 steps of the sales process. And as you can see, the steps are fairly simple. It's 3 steps. You get a little more complex when you try to understand what to do in each step. But when you're aware of where you are, it greatly improves your ability to figure out what you need to do next, what you need to ask, and again, how you respond to objections and whatnot. Now, you might look at those steps and say, well, usually when I work with prospects, because of what I sell, those don't work for me. I usually go through something different. And I would say that there are very common alternatives to how these 3 steps can be put together. For example, and I already kind of talked about this a little bit, it could very easily be the case that you meet with the prospect at the same time as your initial contact, and we refer to this as the instant meeting. What that might look like is you cold call someone and you end up talking to them for 20, 30 minutes. Another scenario that's common for this is you meet someone at a networking event and you end up talking to them for 20 minutes. So those are what I would call instant meetings. In some cases, you're actually just still in the initial contact and you're just taking too much time. If that's the case, you need to realize that you need to start moving quicker and be more efficient with how you're using the prospect's time. But if you do flow into an instant meeting, in some instances, that's okay. In some instances, you probably might be making a tactical mistake and might benefit from having a division between the initial contact and the meeting step. To drill into that a little bit more, there are some instances where an instant meeting is either ideal, okay, or something you should try to do. And one scenario is maybe you're on the phone with someone that you think you'll never be able to get a hold of again, and they're interested in talking right then. Well, if that's the case, hey, just have the meeting right then. That's fine. Although I would say if they're that impossible to get a hold of, then they might not be a qualified prospect. So if you can't get them to meet with you on another day, then maybe that's not just someone that you could ever have a legitimate lead or sales opportunity with, because you're never going to be able to meet with them again, even if you generate some interest. But needless to say, if you can't get a hold of them, just maybe get as much as you can out of the call. Now, another scenario could be if your initial contact is face-to-face. For example, you meet someone at a conference and you're just both there, so just have an instant meeting. It just might make more sense. Or let's say you do cold walking and you're already at the office of the prospect. Another scenario is if your product is fairly simple, meaning it just doesn't make sense for you to stop and regroup on another day because it's just kind of a simple conversation. Let's just have it right now. An instant meeting is just fine. Another scenario could be maybe your prospect is on a tight deadline and they just want to keep going and work through it. Hey, sure, have an instant meeting. But in most scenarios, if those aren't at play, those factors, you probably want to kind of stop and be aware of, basically, let me give you an example. you can accidentally fall into an instant meeting, especially when cold calling. If you cold call and let's say your prospect starts to ask you a question or two, this is very easy for you to fall into an instant meeting where you maybe could have, if you have more awareness of the different steps, you might try to prevent that. But it's very reasonable for you to flow into an instant meeting, because especially if you're cold calling and you're having some rejection, and then finally you have with other prospects, and then finally you have a prospect who's asking good questions, it might be so welcome that you just naturally fall into an instant meeting, and next thing you know, you talk to them for 20 minutes. The problem there is that if you schedule a meeting on another day, instead of having 15 or 20 minutes, you might end up having a 30-minute meeting, which means you double the amount of time that you have with the prospect. So, and that's really the first point here, is that if you stop the instant meeting and you pause, and then you instead schedule that meeting on another day, you are sure to get more time and attention with the prospect than just trying to drag out a cold call for 15 to 20 minutes. Another thing is, if you have an appointment on another day, both you and the prospect will typically be able to become more prepared in terms of questions to ask and things to say and things to talk about if you regroup on another day. And typically when you flow into an instant meeting, you often are missing a closing opportunity. Not a closing opportunity to sell your product, but a closing opportunity to close the prospect on meeting on another day. For example, let's say the prospect asks you, well, what is the transition like if we were wanting to move forward? Then instead of, that might be such a welcome question that you're like, oh, well, the transition is this, and then we do that, and we do this, and then you just give them the answer to their question. But if you hold back on answering their question, then you have leverage or a carrot to make them interested in meeting with you on another day. And what you can do is you can say, well, you know what, that's a really good question. And it's actually a bit of an explanation for me to answer that. What do you say we pause right here, get back together? I could put 15, 20 minutes on your calendar for later in the week, and I'll actually show you a couple slides that answer that question more visually for you. And then I can answer any other questions you have. Are you interested in putting that on the calendar? Or if you really want to know and you have another 20 minutes right now, we could do that right now if you want. I can actually send you a virtual meeting invite and we can meet virtually right now if you want. So what I just did there is, instead of answering the question, I went for the close for the next step of my sales process. Remember, the goal is not to sell the product, the goal is to sell the next step. So I use that. Now, let's say if you don't realize where you are in the sales process and you just end up flowing into an instant meeting, which is you answer that question, then you answer another question, and then you think, oh, well, what do you say we get together on another day? You've given the prospect what they're wondering, so there's less motivation for them to agree to meet with you, so you miss out on a closing opportunity. Now, another scenario is you have your initial contact, you set a meeting or an appointment, you meet with them, and it flows into the presentation at the same time of the meeting. And what that can look like is you meet with them, it's a back and forth, 15 minutes about them, then 15 minutes about you, and then you end up opening up your laptop and showing a slide deck on your product or service. No problem at all. We call this an instant presentation, and the same factors apply. Like, there are certain situations where this just makes more sense than getting back together on another day for your presentation. And the same factors apply that would make this a not ideal scenario. Like, you might end up with more time to deliver your presentation if you have it on a different day. So I'll leave it up to you as to which to decide. But as you can see, just because these are 3 individual steps doesn't necessarily mean they have to be on 3 different days. In fact, they could all happen at the same time. You may sell a very simple product or service and can be sold in what you could call a one-call close, and you might say, these 3 steps don't apply to me because I have a one-call close product and I either sell it or I don't. And what I would say is that these 3 steps even apply to a one-call close. even if you sell your product on one individual call with a prospect, you still should go through these 3 individual steps, and I'll show you what that might look like. You call up a prospect, you talk to them for 2 to 5 minutes, ask them 1 to 2 questions, and you identify that they could potentially fit with what you sell. Then at that point, you say something like this: oh, you know what? I think it might be productive for us to talk in more detail because you could potentially really benefit or fit well with what we do. Do you have another 5 to 10 minutes? I want to ask you a couple other questions. So right there, you're closing for the meeting. Then you talk for another 5 minutes, ask them a couple more questions, learn a little bit more about them, and then you say something like this: well, based on your particular situation, there are 3 different packages that you could choose from with how we could help you. And then at this point, you begin to show them the 3 different packages. You've now progressed to the presentation step. You share the 3 packages and you sell package 2 to them. One call close, you went through each of these 3 steps. Now, how does that benefit you? Well, by knowing the different steps that you're at, it makes it more clear for you in terms of where you're at, what you need to accomplish, and how you need to control and manage the prospect. In that example, you could actually have 3 different closes. You close for talking more, which is basically the meeting. Then you might close for getting them to agree to hear the 3 packages you have. So you close for the presentation. Then you actually close them on one of the options at the end of the call. So just an example there. Now, that's pretty much it. It's just those 3 steps. Becoming more aware of that can greatly improve your ability to sell, ability to control the sales process, ability to know what to say and ask. And we're going to keep coming back to those 3 steps throughout this webinar series and throughout the Smart Sales System. And if there's one thing I want you to remember from this, it's this concept right here. And this was actually one of the core concepts, and a concept that's going to come into play every step of the way through the Smart Sales System. And that is, don't sell the product, sell the meeting. And so this is basically saying, resist that natural desire to sell the product and focus on the ultimate goal, and instead focus on just trying to get the prospect to go the next step. So that might be setting the appointment or scheduling, getting the prospect to agree to the presentation. And this will come into play when we talk about cold calling, cold emailing, dealing with objections, getting around gatekeepers, closing, and whatnot.